and welcome to the class on imagination and wonder. We're moving a bit away and yet not away at all from creativity and innovation. Imagination and wonder, as I'm going to argue this week through this class, through the resources and activities we have, are part and parcel of what we talk about when we talk about creating and innovating. How is that so? Well, to understand that, we have to go back to an expanded vocabulary of creativity. These are terms that we came across then again in the course. Creating and innovating are top of the list. This is what we talk about. But improvisation, imagination, genius, fantasy, utopia, agency, and many other related words came about. The reason we have such a big vocabulary of creating and creativity is that this is a very complex phenomenon, and each one of these terms actually places a unique emphasis on different aspects of it. So in this week, we're going to look at what the imagination brings to this mix. Creativity, imagination, fantasy. These are different terms, and yet they have today a rather common meaning in many ways. Etymologically, they came from different places. So in Greek, the term fantasia, Latin fantasia, I don't speak Greek, so apologies for that, emphasizes the creative properties of our imagination. So the fact that when we imagine, we actually bring something new into existence. In contrast, though, there was another Greek term, eikasia. The Roman equivalent was imaginatio, which is very close to imagination, which actually emphasized the imitative nature of our imagination. So the fact that when we close our eyes and we build mental representations, we actually imitate what we have seen just before or long time ago, but we create replicas, imitations of what already exists. The word creativity equally has many roots, but the main one is Latin. The root of the word is creare, means bringing forth, producing, and crescere, which means arising or growing. So if imagination has to do with creating new mental images with new properties or imitating what we already know and building representations of that, creativity has to do a lot with making things, bringing things forward. If we look at the historical trajectory of our interest in imagination, first of all, Aristotle identified imagination as that in virtue of which an image occurs in us. So that is a very powerful definition because it points to imagination as image construction. And that is both useful, it makes it more concrete, but quite limiting, as we're going to talk a bit later on. If perception is always true, imagination can produce what Aristotle and others called false images, phantasma. So fantasy is interesting because it has this ancient root of thinking about false images, things that can lead you astray in many ways. And that's how in medieval times, imagination and images were actually seen as this intermediary station between the senses, our perception, and reason, generalized concepts, abstract notions. Immanuel Kant distinguished between two sides of the imagination, and this is a very important distinction until today. One of them is productive imagination that creates new images and experiences, and the other one is reproductive imagination, in which, for instance, you close your eyes and you try to remember, even to build an image of where you left your keys or how your apartment looks. This is a reproductive type of imagination. Early psychologists, we're talking 19th, 20th century, reduced imagination to mental images or imagery, and this tradition continues until today. The initiator of it, and the initiator of empirical studies on imagination, was Francis Galton. In the 19th century, he conducted the first psychological study known as Galton's breakfast table, because he actually interviewed scientists about how vivid their images are of their breakfast the morning before. It's an interesting study. I'm not going to say more about it, but you can definitely look for it and see Galton's findings. During behaviorism, a long era in psychology, imagination was actually banished because obviously it was impossible to measure. How do you measure imagination in terms of behavior when a lot of it happens seemingly inside one's head? The cognitive revolution, of course, brought back imagination, but it brought it in a very reduced form in terms of mental images, basically. Uh, Processes such as mental scanning or rotating images became the way in which cognitive scientists and psychologists studied imagination. But there is another story to be told here. Imagination is not only about images and representations, but it is primarily about experience. This is what sociocultural psychologists do when they take a very different starting point in the way they discuss imagination. Vygotsky is one of these psychologists. He said that the creative activity of the imagination depends directly on the richness and variety of a person's previous experience, because this experience provides the material from which the products of fantasy are constructed. The richer a person's experience, the richer is the material his imagination has access to. This became known as the first law of imagination of Vygotsky, and it basically states that imagination is grounded in our current experience. The more experience we have, the richer our imagination. So in many ways, imagination both derives from experience and ends up expanding experience and transforming it. How does that happen? Zitoun and different collaborators proposed a model of the imagination as a loop. Imagination as a form of enrichment, expansion of one's experience, and one's understanding of the world. So, in order to understand the imagination and how it works, we need to distinguish between proximal experiences and distal experiences. Proximal experiences are the experience of the here and now. This is our immediate world, the world of perception and action. It's where we are in the present. Yeah. So if you look around and you see your environment, this is your proximal experience. At the same time, though, you have access through the imagination to a series of distal experiences. These are experiences that are not present, but you can still access. Like you can think, what will I eat later? What will happen when I meet a certain friend? You can also go back in time and remember something from your childhood. This is not in your proximal environment, but it is within your sphere of distal experiences. So what imagination does is basically it decouples you from the immediate experience and then it recouples you back and it takes you on this kind of a loop. And the loop, where does the loop go? So it goes into different spaces. One is the temporal dimension. So the loop can go into the future. You can loop imaginatively into what you'll do for dinner or how the world will be like 100 years from now, and you will have an exercise for this week around this and a forum discussion. And you can also loop back into the past. So in many ways, memory becomes a bit the imagination of the past. Memory is always reconstructive, just like reproductive imagination is always potentially creative. You also loop into implausible or hypothetical areas. So we can imagine unicorns and all sorts of creatures that don't exist because we're not grounded in the real. We can go into the implausible. And finally, our imagination helps us generalize our experience of the world. Instead of being trapped in the here and now of perception, we can think in abstract terms and develop broader images and metaphors of the world with the help of our imagination. This model also presents three other elements. The fact that there are different triggers to the imagination. So what can trigger one's imagination? It can be a problem at hand. It can be even boredom. When you're bored, you go on these loops of the imagination. So when you're bored in class, obviously I think you're mentally exploring many different distal spaces. You also have different resources that come in and help your loop of imagination. What kind of resources? So for instance, past experience, right? Remembering when you were in the park helps you imagine how it is like to be in nature or to be in a park. But also music and books, people who read novels like Harry Potter, right? This contributes to your loops of imagination. Everything you read and you see, cinema, conversations with others become resources for the way you imagine new things. And finally, you have a lot of outcomes of imagination. One of them is that you can become more creative, but at the same time, you can imagine things without necessarily creating anything with them. So that is not a predetermined outcome. Another outcome is that you can have a better understanding of yourself or the world around you through the imagination. Because by looping out and coming back, you're not actually the same person coming back. You've enriched your experience with resources that exist in the sphere of the past, of the future, of the impossible or the implausible and the general. So towards the end, I want to call your attention also on things that are very deeply connected with the imagination, utopias and dystopias. These are historical points of fascination for us. Utopias reflect perfect worlds we construct. Dystopias talks about how these worlds can fail and actually become failed worlds. There's a great enthusiasm in creating utopias around worlds of scholars and the way academia could take over. Probably it's not going to happen. Socialism is very much present in the way we imagine, or people tend to imagine what this utopian society would look like, but also uh, it shows the risks of going into a dystopia and reveals our dislike for either chaos or totalitarianism or things that could go wrong within a utopian universe. So utopia and dystopia are not actually two disconnected genres. They're very much connected because there is a great potential for a utopian project to lead to a dystopian type of scenario. See again Prometheus and often it is actually through the unintended consequences of a utopian world that we end up in a dystopian scenario. For instance, do we really want robots to take care of us or to do all the work for us? There are many examples of utopias. They are religious, obviously. Some of the first ones, one of the most important ones is Thomas More's Utopia, written in 1516, in the 16th century. If you haven't read it, please do that. I didn't put it on the reference list for the course, but it is really a wonderful book. And it really makes one think about the nature of human imagination. Utopia means nowhere, utopos. Yeah, the land is not specified. It's neither here nor there. And after Thomas More, you have so many people who picked up the genre: Francis Bacon, Robert Owen. Marx and the Communist Manifesto could be seen as kind of a utopian manifesto. And even Skinner in psychology, maybe some of you don't know, but he wrote different novels. Walden 2 expresses a utopian world. In dystopias, you have many of them. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is one of the most famous ones, 1818. And of course, we know Frankenstein as the monster. It's actually Frankenstein is the scientist, and Frankenstein's monster is the creature. And this dystopia is very much a story of creativity. It's a story of creativity going out of control. You created something that you cannot control, you can't place in the world, and it comes back to haunt you, literally in the case of Frankenstein. And then you have a tradition from Huxley to George Orwell with 1984 and The Animal Farm, wonderful and terrifying dystopias. And even in cinemas, The Terminator, Matrix, and others are very much dystopian themes. So if we think about utopia and dystopia, we notice that the lines are blurred. Hieronymus Bosch, painting in the 16th century, early 16th century, he was the painter, if you remember and you see in this image, had these little details of the world that are both enchanting and terrifying. This is the garden of earthly delights, and you can see a transition from a paradise on the left hand side to hell on the right hand side, and in between the world which combines both utopian and dystopian elements, things that we love, admire, and things that we fear. Do we still need utopias? Do we still need these big imaginations of the future? In many ways, after the 20th century, when history and the Holocaust and all the horrors that happened during that century, history eclipsed and ridiculed in many ways our most daring plans and our most daring imaginations. History showed us that things are possible that should not be envisioned, that should not be made possible. So, in many ways, people today are arguing that what is important about utopia is less what is imagined than the act of imagination itself. Because what utopias do is they disrupt the closure of the present, they disrupt the comfortable way in which we live, and they make us dare to think about impossible worlds, worlds that are very much out there, but they can still inspire us. For many people, big utopias can be dangerous, while little ones actually happen on a daily basis and they have the potential to transform our lives. Wikipedia, many forms of interaction on social media, Creative Commons, the Occupy movement are examples of little utopias. Many of them fail, but as we will see also in the next class, in the last week, it is very important to keep engaging in them because they expand the sphere of what is thinkable and therefore also what is doable within society. So, in summary, imagination is an everyday phenomenon which is closely linked to creativity, as I argued. Wonder equally is an everyday occurrence, and it's deeply connected with both imagination and creativity. But I'm going to talk more about wonder when we meet in our synchronous class. Imagination has a complex history, just as creativity does, and it finds its expression in the way we use experience in order to expand and ultimately transform our experience of the world. Utopias, dystopias, and predictions about the future are some of the most powerful, vivid forms of human imagination, and they actually drive our development as societies and also as individuals.